Beckham Law in Spain or Non-Dom in Cyprus? Which tax setup is more sustainable in the long term? Which one is better? My thoughts on this in this video. Hello and welcome. My name is Florian Wilk. I am the Managing Director of CMC, and for 15 years I've been in Larnaca, Cyprus, as well as in Ireland, Georgia, Singapore, and Madeira. And in today's video, I want to introduce you to two very exciting tax models in Europe. For your personal tax residency, one is the so-called Beckham Law in Spain. And on the other hand, we have the Non-Dom regime in Cyprus. And if you don't know much about these yet, this video is meant to give you an overview about the similarities, differences, and maybe even a first hint or direction for your personal tax setup if you're considering emigrating and looking for a new country of tax residence. Just a single fact. If you leave your home country, you might be living in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, or Italy, or anywhere else, and you want to establish a new tax home, then of course, it's very important that you don't just travel around permanently, but actually establish tax residency somewhere in the world. You want to have a tax number, you want to have a social security number, and if in doubt, you want to have tax residency. Get a certificate, file an income tax return, and so on, so that you are recognized for tax purposes, that you have a tax identity. In my opinion, this is a very important point, because otherwise, one day you might have the problem that you have undeclared money in your accounts, since you can't prove that you've paid taxes on those funds. You might think, hey, I was traveling tax-free for 5 years, but you never thought about what would happen if, for example, one day your bank, when you want to buy a property or invest in a fund or something else, asks you about compliance and the origin of your funds. That's often a problem. That's why it's so important to think about where you as a private individual could potentially become tax resident, where you can choose your tax domicile. Spain is, of course, the most popular location among Germans right now. So a lot of people are moving to Spain and taking advantage of what's called the Beckham Law, and the regulations are currently as follows. If you move to Spain as a new resident, which is very important, I mean, you must not have been in Spain for 5 years. So in terms of registration law, before you come to Spain and use the Beckham Law, and it's absolutely crucial that you become a new resident in Spain, that you register yourself in Spain. Often it's on an island, so on Mallorca or the Canary Islands, but of course still in Spain. And then you benefit from a 24% income tax rate. That's certainly not a bad tax rate, and it's also a flat rate. And you have the big advantage, and this is really about structuring things properly. It's always important, of course, to look behind the legislation and carefully analyze what this legislation actually allows me to do at the end of the day. And the interesting thing about the Beckham Law isn't really the 24% income tax rate. Here too, the devil is in the details. But what's truly exciting is that foreign income is exempt from tax. So if you have a company, for example, in Cyprus or in Georgia or in Singapore, always assuming, of course, that there is substance there. We need to have a permanent establishment there, real management on site, some actual value creation. In short, there needs to be substance. And if you then, let's take, for example, the example of Cyprus, a Cypriot company, you have one and you pay out to yourself. As a resident in Spain using the Beckham Law, these profit distributions are actually tax-free. How long does this apply? 5 years? After that, you fall under the regular tax regime. So at that point, you really end up back in the classic high tax bracket, which is simply the case in Spain. It's interesting, personally, what bothers me about the Beckham Law, what I see as a disadvantage, is the very short planning certainty of only 5 to 6 years. And that you have to put in a relatively high amount of effort, because to really get down to the 24%, you obviously have to set up a foreign company, which involves a certain amount of structural effort. You need a managing director, an office, and so on. And of course, that involves not just a certain amount of planning, but also practical effort, because that's the only way it's legally secure. And you shouldn't forget, Spain is truly a classic high-tax country. There is a wealth tax, and the tax authorities are very, very strict and rigorous. And that's why it's all the more important, and this is a fundamental principle of our work anyway, that you naturally approach these matters very, very carefully and thoroughly. But in Spain, it's even more important to really implement and document things down to the last detail so as not to be vulnerable in any way. There are simply a lot of ideas from the legislators, also in Spain, that personally give me some concern. For example, they now want to pay special attention to people who generate high credit card turnovers. Those who, I believe, spend more than 25,000 euros a year on their credit card. They want to focus on them to see where the money for these potentially high credit card transactions is coming from. So there are a lot of ideas in Spain that are simply moving in a very controlling direction. And I think fundamentally that's not a good direction. But the Beckham Law in itself is certainly not unattractive, despite these two drawbacks. That's actually very good. It's limited to a short period of time and therefore also requires a lot of effort. For the structuring around it, in order to actually achieve this effectively lower tax rate of less than 24%. Now moving on to the non-dom status in Cyprus. What can you expect there? Cyprus is a relatively large Mediterranean island, the third largest island in the Mediterranean. It's divided, as you might know. We have the Turkish-occupied northern part, and we have the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek part. When I talk about Cyprus, of course, I mean the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek EU part. It's an independent country, not part of Greece, and Cyprus has no industry. And you have to understand that the tax advantages and everything related to people coming into the country are important factors. Then there's renting property, buying property. All of this is a very, very significant economic factor for Cyprus. As a small economy with just over 1 million inhabitants, Cyprus is very, very dependent on people, entrepreneurs, and expatriates who come to the country and simply inject money into the economic cycle. And in that regard, they don't look too closely. And it's not really that important how much tax someone like that actually pays in Cyprus. What matters most is that the local economy is simply supported both directly and indirectly by such expats. So we have a very positive migration to Cyprus. Of course, there are also fewer coming, but there are fewer overall. Not so much asylum seekers from third countries, but rather a whole lot of entrepreneurs above all. Freelancers, taxpayers at the end of the day, coming to the island who really contribute to the community. Yes, that's an important, let me say for understanding, an important factor that simply has to be mentioned in connection with Cyprus. And that's why Cyprus has also traditionally been attractive from a tax perspective in the past, especially because of corporate taxes, which if I think back 15 years, were at 10% back then and even lower before that. Now, they've been very stable for several years already at 12.5%. In my opinion, that's how it will stay. And in some cases, you even have certain discounts with 2.5%. So there are also huge savings opportunities there, for example, on software licenses or royalties. So that's another special factor. And on a personal level, since 2016, since the non-dom law exists, you also have many tax advantages. And now I come to the main point, the non-dom law in Cyprus. You only need to stay for 60 days a year. So unlike most countries where the 183-day rule applies, here it's the 60-day rule. That's a very, very big advantage. Of course, in Cyprus, as long as you don't spend more than 183 days anywhere else, obviously. And on the other hand, you have 17 years planning security. So you know, because the tax authorities, or more precisely the Ministry of Finance, certifies for you that you are exempt from the defense contribution, which is essentially the capital gains tax for 17 years. You simply know that you can plan ahead. You have legal certainty to be able to live in Cyprus for 17 years. It's not mandatory, but you have the option to really make full use of those 17 years without having to worry about your tax matters. And that's very, very powerful, of course, this planning security. And what does non-dom actually mean in terms of taxes? It means that you are exempt from taxes on dividend distributions, but also on interest income. That means, for example, if you invest in the capital market and receive a lot of dividends from stocks or interest income, it's tax-free. On top of that, for everyone in Cyprus, profits from the sale of securities are tax-free. So even if you buy and sell a stock, the whole thing is tax neutral. But, and this is often the main motivation for our clients, if you have your own company, for example, a Cyprus Limited, the Limited pays its 2.5 or at most 12.5% corporate tax, and as the shareholder, you distribute profits to yourself. You make a profit distribution of 100,000, 500,000 euros, whatever the amount, then as a non-dom in Cyprus, this profit distribution is tax-free. That is a huge, huge advantage. You pay a health contribution, 2.65%, which is also capped. But the tax, the capital gains tax on this profit distribution does not apply. And I have to say, if I compare the two, the Beckham Law and the non-dom regime in Cyprus, then personally, I would always choose Cyprus. For the simple reason that Cyprus is just very, very stable and offers me long-term security. It gives me these advantages with the 60-day rule, 17 years of planning security, and tax exemption on capital income. So it's really a very, very interesting mix. And if in doubt, I don't need the huge effort like with the Beckham Law, where I would need an additional foreign structure. If I want, I can do everything directly in Cyprus, but even there, I could optimize further. So those are all options, of course. From my point of view, it's more straightforward and above all, and this is the crucial point, more long-term. Because 5 years go by quickly. And if you then end up back in the top tax bracket, in my opinion, that's not really desirable. And maybe they're speculating that people will simply be lured into the country. And then after 5 years, they say, okay, now I've settled in so well, I'll just stay and pay the top tax rates. And personally, I don't think that's a good long-term solution. It's not completely optimal. What we also often see, just to mention this on the side, is that we frequently have clients who live in both Cyprus and Spain. You can, so to speak, combine the pleasant with the pleasant. After all, both are very, very beautiful locations. And if you can then live in the pleasant location of Cyprus and the pleasant location of Spain, and also take advantage of the useful aspect, namely the tax savings, then I think that's an optimal situation. There are a few things to keep in mind regarding the structure of the whole thing, so you don't fall into a trap and suddenly the tax authorities say, wait a minute, your center of life is actually with us. Now we want to tax you retroactively and at the regular tax rate, no Beckham Law for you. You really have to be careful about that, absolutely. But that's exactly why we have checklists and are more than happy to support you with your situation. Planning for your intention to emigrate. So feel free to take advantage of the opportunity. You can book a completely free and non-binding consultation. This will take place via video conference, either on Zoom or Google Meets. You'll find the link below this video and you can sign up for free and without any obligation. Thank you so much for your attention. Feel free to leave me a comment. I reply to every comment. I'm also happy about a thumbs up, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I would be delighted if I could reach 10,000 subscribers soon. And of course, it also helps me if you share the video with friends or acquaintances who are also interested in the topic of emigrating, whether to Spain, Cyprus, or anywhere else in the world, because it's often the combination of different locations that really makes the difference, both for your lifestyle and of course to get the most out of it from a tax perspective. So thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all the best. Take care, yours, Florian Wilk.